Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and I have covered the 1960s before in my How the Year Was Won series, like a previous video I did about the 1960 year. I have also covered 1962 and 1965, which I will put links below or in the upper right-hand corner. But this next year I will be covering is a special year, because it was the 100th year of college football, and it would see some of the best teams to have played in college football, as well as some of the biggest and most important games in college football history. Along with that, this year would end with controversy that involved the President of the United States. But before I get into the year of 1969, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below if you are not already subscribed. If you are subscribed, ring the bell as well so you can get updates on brand new videos and shorts that I will be dropping all throughout the rest of the college football season. You can also check out my Patreon and help out the channel there. You can check out my social media and my podcast. All the links are in the description below. And of course, like and share this video with other college football fans. But before we get into the season, we have to cover some of the top teams coming into this season. First is going to be the team that was coming into the season as the defending national champions, and we're also coming into the season as one of the greatest teams to ever be in college football. And there was some good reasons for that, as the Ohio State Buckeyes were coming off of an amazing 1968 season where they had a group of great super sophomores led by QB Rex Kern, fullback Jim Otis, and on defense they had linebacker Jack Tatum. As sophomores, they stunned the college football world by shutting out Purdue, who were ranked number 1 at the time. Then they would demolish the rest of the Big Ten and cap off the season with a huge 50-14 win over Michigan. And just save that information for later on in the video. Ohio State would conclude the year with a big come-from-behind win over USC to win the Rose Bowl and the national title. So now this group of super sophomores were juniors, and all of them were coming back, along with their Hall of Fame coach Woody Hayes, so it was no argument that this was going to be the best team coming into 1969. The next team is the best team out of the East. That was Penn State. And Penn State were like Ohio State, as they were coming off of a spectacular 1968 season where they also went undefeated. They went 11-0, but they went to the Orange Bowl. But even with that unblemished record and big bowl win, they finished 3rd in the coaches poll and 2nd in the AP poll. On top of that, Penn State hadn't lost a game since October 14th of 1967. So they were really good, but got no respect from the national pollsters. And they were looking to be good again this year, as they were bringing back their fantastic offensive line to block for their great running back in Charlie Pittman. Along with Pittman, Penn State would also have their sophomore Franco Harris, who was slightly unknown coming into the season, but by the end was one of their best weapons. Penn State would also be known for the next 30 years to be linebacker U, and they would be bringing back a fantastic linebacker in Jack Ham. The future NFL Hall of Famer was a sophomore in 1968 and broke onto the scene to help the defense get their first undefeated season, and he also set a record that season with 3 blocked punts. Along with all those players back, it was no shock that Penn State were picked to be the best team out of the East, but nationally they were still not given a lot of credit, as they were ranked 3rd in the preseason poll. And the team that was slightly ahead of Penn State was Arkansas. Arkansas were coming off of a 10-1 year, and they won the Sugar Bowl the previous year. They would be bringing back most of their team, as well as their top 15 defense and legendary head coach Frank Broyles. Arkansas had been the tops of the Southwestern Conference, along with another top team in their rival Texas. And speaking of Texas, they would be ranked in the preseason poll at number 4 behind Arkansas and Penn State. And some fans might have been annoyed since Texas had beaten Arkansas the previous year. But after Texas were upset by Texas Tech, Texas would share the Southwest Conference title with Arkansas. And just like Arkansas, Texas were also bringing back most of their team and their legendary head coach in Darrell Royal. But unlike Arkansas, Texas were more well known for their fantastic offense, which was only going to be better as their QB James Street was back and was looking to win the Southwest Conference outright in 1969. I'll get more into both of these teams as the season progresses, because a lot of stuff would happen before they would meet in December. But rounding out the top 5 was USC, who were once again the top of the West. That was mostly due to their Hall of Fame coach John McKay, who made USC one of the best of the 1960s, as they had won 2 national titles and went to 4 Rose Bowls during this decade, and were looking for a 5th to cap off the decade. They were bringing back most of their offensive line. They would have a Super Bowl and Hall of Fame winning coach at quarterback in Mike Holmgren, but Holmgren was mostly a backup as he lost his job to Jimmy Jones, who was one of only a handful of African-American quarterbacks in the country at this point. But there are the top 5 to start the season, and really they were the top of the poll through September as there were no big games of note. I do want to mention one that had absolutely no bearing on the national title but would have some history surrounding it, as on September 27th, Princeton would travel a few miles north to Rutgers to commemorate their 100th anniversary of the first college football game. The game would have top billing on TV, and it was broadcasted on ABC. It would result in a 29-0 win for Rutgers, and Rutgers and Princeton would only play each other for about the next decade or so, and haven't played each other since the late 1970s. But let's get into October, which would have the start of changes in the poll. The October 4th weekend would have the number 2 Penn State, who were 2-0 at this point after beating Navy and Colorado in September. They were playing Kansas State this week, though. And if you know your college football history, then you know how bad Kansas State was. And in the 1960s, they were consistently terrible. As from 1960 to 1968, they went 13-75. Yeah, that's a winning percentage of about 11%. But they were starting the season on the right foot, as they were 2-0 and they had scored over 40 points per game in both wins. But even though Kansas State were 2-0, they weren't seen as any sort of a threat to Penn State, since Penn State had beaten them 25-9 the previous year. But this year's game was going to be in Manhattan, Kansas, so at least Kansas State had something good going for them, and maybe being at home, or maybe due to the fact that Kansas State had their best team in decades this year, the game would become a slugfest. But luckily their defense held on for long enough so Penn State could score a final time to win 17-14 and continue their undefeated streak. Unfortunately, that win would look bad to most pollsters, as pollsters would send Penn State all the way down to number 5, with USC now at number 4, Texas at number 2, and Arkansas at number 3. Next week would bring some big matchups, with 4 out of the top 5 playing against another ranked team. Number 1 Ohio State, who were now 3-0, after scoring 40 points per game, they would be playing number 19 Michigan State. And this game would continue Ohio State's trend of scoring over 40 points and winning a lot, as they won 54-21. Penn State would also dominate as they beat number 17 West Virginia 20-0. And this win would look really good for Penn State at the end of the season, as West Virginia would end their season 10-1 and ranked in the top 20. Number 3 Arkansas was on a bye, and the other 2 top 5 teams had tougher games. First, number 2 Texas would have their Red River rivalry versus number 8 Oklahoma. And Oklahoma were the defending Big 8 champions, but took a step back as they were only 7-4 the previous year. They were bringing back Steve Owens, who was their fantastic running back, who had run for over 2,000 yards already in the first 2 years, and was known to throw the ball too. But even with that future Heisman winner, spoiler alert, Oklahoma would get only 17 points, and Texas and that great offense would manage to outscore them as they won 27-17. But Oklahoma's defense did hold back Texas's offense pretty well, better than most Texas opponents, so that at least shows something pretty good for Oklahoma. To cap off the day was number 5 USC, who would play their rival number 16 Stanford. And Stanford were really good at this point, as they were 2-1 and had taken the previous top 10 Purdue to the limit the previous week, only losing by 1 point. Along with that, Stanford would have the next year's Heisman winner at QB in Jim Plunkett. And Plunkett was in his second year and was showing his talents as he got Stanford to finish 3rd in the Pac-8, which was their highest place in years. And Plunkett almost pulled off an upset of USC the previous year in 1968. And this year would be the same, as USC and Stanford battled all game. But Plunkett and Stanford fell just short of a huge upset as they lost 26-24. And with the close USC win, they would jump the idle Arkansas and be ranked at number 3, with Ohio State staying at 1, Texas at number 2, and Penn State now still at number 5. Going to next week of October 18th, I have to go back to USC, as they would have another huge game as they traveled to South Bend to play number 11 Notre Dame. And Notre Dame were 3-1 after losing to Purdue, but were coached by Ara Persigan, and at QB they had Joe Theismann. Notre Dame had come closer than Stanford did in recent years versus USC, as Notre Dame tied USC the previous year in their season finale. This year's game would go the same way, as it resulted in another tie, as Notre Dame scored late to ruin another perfect season for USC, and that tie would result in some changes in the poll, as well as Penn State's game, which was also that day, as they would play their longtime Eastern rival Syracuse. Syracuse weren't the top of the East anymore, but they were still a really good team, as they finished with a 6-4 record in 1968, which was their worst since 1962. Plus, they were coming into this game at 3-1. The game would be another slugfest for Penn State, who had to hang on yet again, winning 15-14. So due to their close win and USC's tie, both teams would be out of the top 5. But Ohio State were still number 1, with Texas at number 2, and new number 3 Tennessee, who jumped from number 7 to 3 after beating Alabama handily in Birmingham, while Missouri was now the new number 5, after they were number 6 for weeks, so they just waited for one of those top 5 teams to trip up and get their way into the top 5. So after that week of poll movements, there was only one significant move, which I'll get to, as the other teams all destroyed their opponents. Ohio State continued their trend of scoring over 40 points as they destroyed Illinois 41-0. Number 2 Texas would also shut out Rice. Arkansas would also score a bunch, winning 52-14 over Wichita State, and Penn State, now at number 8, won easily over Ohio 42-3. And I mentioned Penn State because they would come back into the top 5 due to an upset that would happen in Boulder, as Missouri went on the road and were beat by unranked Colorado 31-24. Due to that loss, Penn State would jump from number 8 back into the top 5, while Arkansas State at number 4, Tennessee were number 3, Texas at 2, and Ohio State were still at number 1. But now we are in November, and this would be a tale of 2 different seasons, as the first 2 weeks of November resulted in no poll changes. That was due to all of the top teams winning, and after November 8th, all the top 5 were now 7-0, with 3 games remaining to figure out who would be the national champion. The next important game would happen on November 15th down in the SEC, as Tennessee had been making their way through the SEC and were headed to Jackson, Mississippi to play Ole Miss. Ole Miss were 5-3 at this point, but 2 of those losses, which were in the SEC, were by 1 point. Along with that, they had Archie Manning at quarterback, who led them to a huge 3-point win 2 weeks before against LSU. And their defense was getting better as the season went on. And in this game, this defense really showed how good they were, as they dominated Tennessee. And Manning kicked off the scoring with a touchdown run and then scored 2 more times in the first quarter to allow Ole Miss to run away with a huge 38-0 win. So with that big top 5 loss, the new top 5 halfway through November would see Ohio State at number 1, then Texas, then Arkansas, Penn State at 4, and rounding out the top 5 was USC. So we were pretty much back to the beginning of our season. So even though these top 5 teams moved around, they would all be back as we got to the real meat and potatoes of this season, which would start the weekend of November 22nd, which had a lot of rivalries as per usual. I know you know of the big one this week, but let's get into the other 2. First was Penn State, who were 8-0, and they traveled to Pittsburgh to play Pitt. Pitt were 4-5 at this point and had not beaten Penn State in the last 3 years, with last year's game being a huge 65-9 loss. This year, Pitt didn't give up that many points, but still lost to Penn State 27-7. So now Penn State were 9-0. In addition, this week was also the week where Penn State made their bowl decision. This would result in some big news later on, but before the 1980s, college bowl games would try to sign their teams for their games before the end of the regular season. This sometimes would result in busted bowl games, when those big-time teams lost late in the season, but most of the time bowl games had to do this to make sure that their games would get big-time teams and draw in viewerships and draw some tickets. Penn State had been known to go to the Gator Bowl, which was a mid-level bowl, but after an undefeated 1968 season, they went to the Orange Bowl. This allowed them to gain another top opponent, as the Orange Bowl had routinely invited the Big 8 champion. But instead of Penn State accepting the Orange Bowl again, they were apparently given an option to play in the Cotton Bowl or the Orange Bowl. And if they played in the Cotton Bowl, they would potentially play a team that was number 1 in the country, and this could be a national title game. I say potentially because at this point Ohio State were the clear number 1 team, and they were going to the Rose Bowl no matter what, which Penn State could not get into. Penn State's coach Joe Paterno, who was only in his 4th season, gave his team the vote to either accept the Orange Bowl or the Cotton Bowl. The majority of the team would pick the Orange Bowl for the 2nd straight year, and there were some theories to that. One was that Dallas was still kind of segregated, and Penn State were an integrated team, and they didn't want to deal with all that came of it. Another theory is that since most thought Ohio State was the best team and going to the Rose Bowl, there was no way for Penn State to play them. So why should they go to Dallas when they could go to Miami and still play a top team and still potentially win the national championship? So with the Orange Bowl all figured out, we gotta go to the Rose Bowl now, as the Pac-8 title would be figured out with USC and UCLA playing in LA. Both teams were unbeaten at 8-0-1, but UCLA's tie was in conference, so they had to win this game to secure their spot in the Rose Bowl. Plus, they were only ranked at number 6, just outside of the top 5, and that's where they've been hanging out all season, so that's why I really haven't mentioned them until now. The game would start slow, as it was 7-6 throughout most of the game, until a late score by USC for them to have a 12-7 lead. USC would have one final drive, which was capped by a Jimmy Jones 32-yard touchdown pass with a minute left for USC to secure the 14-12 win and be 9-0-1, win the Pac-8 title, and they were gonna go to the Rose Bowl. But who were they gonna play? Well, that would be figured out earlier in the day, as Ohio State would travel to Ann Arbor to play Michigan. Now, Michigan were under a very new regime, as Bo Schembechler was the new head coach. He had been a player at Miami of Ohio late in the 1940s, then started his assistant coaching career in the Midwest. He made stops at Northwestern and Ohio State, as he was an assistant coach under Woody Hayes in 1951, and then again from 1958 to 1962. After being an assistant under legends like Ara Parseghian, Woody Hayes, and Sid Gilman, Bo got his first head coaching position at his alma mater, Miami of Ohio. He would coach it for 6 years, going 40, 17, and 3, and he never had a losing record. Due to his coaching career and his knowledge of the Midwest and Big Ten, Michigan would choose for Bo to take over for Bump Elliott in 1969. Bo's first season at Michigan was up and down to start, as they lost to Missouri and Michigan State, but beat Purdue to start their season, so they would be 3-2. They would win 4 in a row to be 7-2 and only had one loss in the conference, meaning they still had a chance to not only ruin Ohio State's perfect season, but win the Big Ten. This was huge. This game has been talked at length, so I won't be going too much into the game, but this game would result in one of the biggest upsets of the decade, as Michigan fought off the second best offense in college football and only allowed them to score 12 points. And this team was scoring 40 plus a game, as Michigan would score 3 times to win 24-12. And this one was shocking to most around the country, as it was a foregone conclusion that Ohio State was going to go to the Rose Bowl, especially after they destroyed Purdue the previous week by 30 points. But with the loss and the fact that the Big Ten only sent one team to the bowl games, it meant that Ohio State, after losing their first game in over 2 years, were not going to a bowl game, and their season was over at 9-1. Just crazy. So after all of that, the top 5 would look drastically different, as now Texas would be number 1, Arkansas would be number 2, Penn State was number 3, Ohio State would only drop to number 4, just ahead of USC, who were still undefeated, which is weird. So the season would be over for Ohio State and USC, and Penn State would play and beat NC State the last weekend in November to remain undefeated and end their season 10-0. I'm just going to go through that game quickly because it doesn't really matter. Because the season would not be over, as we are now into December, and it would be the biggest and most important game of the season, as Texas would play Arkansas, and it would pit number 1 versus number 2. This game was so big and got even bigger since it was moved to later in the season. The reason for that was that ABC wanted this game to be moved and have a bigger platform at the end of the season. Instead, this game usually happened in mid-October. ABC executives worked on it all summer to get this game moved, and even persuaded the president, Richard Nixon, to attend this game, since he was a huge football fan. With the promise of the president in attendance, as well as ABC promising to air Arkansas's season opening game in 1970, Arkansas head coach Frank Broyles was in. And ABC now having the game moved and the president attending it, this game was gonna be a big game. But the game would reach the highest of heights with the shocking Ohio State loss the previous week, and this game now pitting number 1 versus number 2. So now ABC could officially give this game the name, the game of the century. And it kind of was, because Texas was coming in averaging over 44 points per game with their wishbone offense, and Arkansas had the best scoring defense as they were giving up less than a touchdown a game. So it was going to be a real clash, which got some more added to it when rain fell the night before, making the field a little slippery. So now with over 45,000 people in attendance, including the president, and I just want to go back to him real quick because he had quite the trek to get to this game. Since this game was played in Fayetteville, there wasn't a big enough airport for Air Force One to land in Fayetteville or near Fayetteville. So they had to go all the way to the Fort Smith Regional Airport, which is like a military airport, and then take Marine One, which flew from Fort Smith to Fayetteville, and actually they landed it in the practice fields just east of the Razorback Stadium just before kickoff so the president could be in the stands at the game. And with over 45,000 people in attendance, and this game was being watched by about 50% of the country, they would see one of the best games of the year, as Arkansas would take an early lead after a Texas fumble, and then add on to that, being up just 14-0 into the third quarter. But after half, Texas would finally start to get their offense rolling, as Texas quarterback James Street ran in a touchdown and would add a 2-point conversion to be up 14-8. This was super significant, as Darrell Royal mentioned after the game that he didn't want the game to end in a tie, so that's why going for 2 on that touchdown made some sense later. Then later in the game, Arkansas drove to the Texas 7 and looked like they were going to put the game away, but they were intercepted in the end zone. Texas would turn the ball over again and actually turned the ball over 6 times in this game, but got one more chance with less than 5 minutes left and complete this game of the century with a memorable play. It was 4th down, and Texas was on their own 43-yard line. Instead of calling a short pass play or a run, Texas coach Darrell Royal called right 53 veer pass, which was a deep pass pattern. James Street was stunned at the play call, and even more stunned when the play worked, as he completed a 44-yard pass to put Texas in scoring position. It would only take 2 more plays for them to score, and they would kick the extra point, which would give them the 15-14 lead, and they would hold on to win by that same score. After the win, President Nixon would give a plaque to Texas and Darrell Royal, proclaiming them as the national champions of college football. If this was a few years ago, it would have been fine, but over the last few years of the 1960s, both the AP and Coaches Poll were naming their national champion after the bowl game, so this proclamation was taken with a grain of salt at this point. And now with the regular season over, we can finally get into the bowl games, as there would be some controversy beforehand. That controversy would happen in the SEC, as LSU apparently tried to push themselves into the Cotton Bowl instead of going to the Sugar Bowl. The Sugar Bowl was known to have the champions of the SEC, But LSU had pretty much spurned the Sugar Bowl because they wanted to be invited to the Cotton Bowl and play the national champion, and potentially win the title too. Instead, the Cotton Bowl went in a different direction, as Notre Dame was looking for more scholarship money and repealed their long-standing procedure of not going to a bowl game, and put their name in the hat for the Cotton Bowl. The Cotton Bowl would immediately jump at that opportunity to secure one of the biggest TV and fan draws, and made the game Texas vs. Notre Dame for New Year's Day. So now, with all the politicking that LSU had done to get into the Cotton Bowl, they ended up pissing off the Sugar Bowl, which was going to have Arkansas, and picked Ole Miss for the game instead. Ole Miss had finished the season with 2 losses in the SEC, but had beaten LSU and Tennessee, so they were considered a top team. Plus, they also had Archie Manning, which was also a top player everyone wanted to see. Since those big games were filled, Tennessee were the co-champions of the SEC, so they would go to the Gator Bowl, and the other co-champion LSU stayed at home to watch the bowl games on TV. So LSU went for their power play and instead got absolutely nothing in return. But all of the major bowl games would happen on January 1st, 1970, and have all close games that went down to the wire. Ole Miss would beat number 3 Arkansas after they had a 12-point lead at half, and would hold on to win 27-22. Next up was the Orange Bowl, with Penn State versus Big 8 champion Missouri. And Missouri's defense would keep them in the game, as they only gave up 10 first-quarter points, but due to them turning the ball over 9 times, Penn State would hold on to complete a second straight undefeated season, and Penn State would win 10-3. Later on in the afternoon, the Rose Bowl would kick off and have some big news happen just the day before, as Michigan coach Bo Schembechler suffered a mild heart attack, and their defensive coordinator Jim Young was acting as head coach for the game. In the game, Michigan's defense held USC's offense back most of the game, and it was tied 3-3 at half. But the game would finally break open and fall USC's way after a touchdown pass from Jimmy Jones, and USC would hold on to win 10-3 to complete their unbeaten season. But finally was the Cotton Bowl, and this was the most intriguing game of the day, as Notre Dame had not been to a bowl game since 1925, and they got 45 years of not going to a bowl game by giving Texas a huge scare. Notre Dame would take a 10-0 lead early in the second quarter and hold it through most of the second half, until Texas finally got moving in the fourth quarter. Texas would score to take the lead, but 4 minutes later, Notre Dame scored again to have a 17-14 lead. With only a minute left, Texas was on a 17-play, 76-yard drive to score, and they finally took a 21-17 lead. But there was still time left, so Notre Dame would have one more chance to score, but it wasn't enough, so Texas would hold on to win 21-17. The win would secure the national title for Texas, and it would be official a day or two later when the AP poll named Texas the national champion, as they had 36 out of 45 first-place votes. Penn State would finish a far back second, as they only had 7 first-place votes. Penn State would end their season on a 22-game undefeated streak and a 30-game unbeaten streak, but had no national titles come from this. This would be a storyline that would tag Penn State for the next decade or so, until they finally won 2 national championships in the 1980s. And this season is often brought up as one of the greatest seasons in college football history, and it really was, not just because it was the 100th anniversary of college football, but just because there were so many great teams in the season, like Penn State. Texas was a great team, Ohio State obviously being a great team. And if you didn't know about that LSU Bowl story, I didn't know about that until I did research on this year, so that was really interesting. If you missed it, I covered 3 previous years in the 1960 decade, like 1960, 62, and 65. You can check all those out in the playlist to the side. I also put links in the description below, so make sure you check that out. Also in the description below, you can help out the channel on my Patreon, or just search Wronged Sports on Patreon. You can find out my channel there. Plus, of course, if you are not already subscribed, do that as well, and ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos, and of course, like and share this video. And one final thing, like and share this video with other college football fans, and have a fantastic rest of your day.